The 2-story deep Kelp Forest tank is another unique exhibit, one of only 2 in the world, and is home to 3 species of kelp and a number of species of fish which have never been exhibited before. A mini amphitheater outside the tank provides a viewing point from which visitors can view the exhibit and communicate with divers in the tank at particular times of the day.
I started here, my first job here after leaving UCT as a research scientist was to actually look after the kelp forest and try and determine why the kelp was growing in certain areas and not so well in others, which they'd kind of hoped initially to get a kelp forest that established itself and then was kind of self-sustaining. That's never proved to be the case. I mean, if you just look around the coast, the kind of biggest, healthiest kelp forests are in the most exposed sections of our coast, and obviously our kelp forest doesn't produce the kind of wave action that keeps kelp clean and free of epiphytes and parasites growing on the fronds. So it never worked out that way, but we certainly added a lot more water movement just to try and keep the kelp as healthy as possible. But in the end, we now collect, we kind of rotate. There's probably, I guess, 100 different plants in that exhibit, and we slowly, over the period of a year or so, remove some that are looking tatty and have not growing nicely, and replace them with fresh kelp, which is such fast growing. It's not a plant, it's an algae, and they're super fast growing, maybe live for a year or 2 in the wild, and as soon as they get too big or too old, they get ripped out by the next storm and end up on the beach, where they complete an amazing cycle.
My name is Kelly Chateau-Seister. I am the research assistant for the People and Oceans Lab at the Two Oceans Aquarium Foundation. So what is kelp? Kelp is this large brown seaweed, and essentially it's not like a plant in the usual sense, but it does have a root-like structure called a holdfast that anchors the plant to the seabed or any hard rock structure. And then it's got this long stipe, and then it's got these blades or fronds that sort of floats up to the sunlight, because seaweed and kelp does photosynthesize. Essentially, kelp creates this beautiful great African sea forest that really provides so much to marine communities, and it's so essential on many different levels, including people. It provides shelter for animals such as crabs, tiny plankton, to animals like penguins and seals, but also it provides so much to people, and we just don't know about it, from the daily products that we consume to the products that we use in our everyday lives, like toothpaste. So kelp is really special because it is a very fast-growing plant or seaweed, and in growing so fast, it creates these intricate and very, very special and unique ecosystem that supports lots and lots of marine biodiversity. It also is a very quiet climate hero. So because this ecosystem is so vast, it essentially stretches from, in South Africa, from the Cape Peninsula right up to the West Coast. And because it's such a large ecosystem, it absorbs so much carbon dioxide, but it also protects the coastal communities from any storms. So that is really special in itself, but it also gives life to so much biodiversity, and it also gives us so much oxygen. So essentially 2 out of every 3 breaths that we take come from kelp, and that's absolutely amazing. And kelp here in South Africa, we are actually super lucky because we've got these kelp forests growing along our coastline, and essentially they thrive in cold, nutrient-rich water, so meaning more the Benguela Current along the west coast of South Africa. And they are really special in another sense because they essentially formed through these like rough and turbid conditions, and it also pays tribute to the communities that thrive along our coastlines. So a lot of our coastal communities forage, they gather food, and they've been fishing in this ecosystem for a really long time. And so it really ties into our cultural heritage and the heritage of Cape Town and the kelp forests that are so important, on which these fishing grounds are able to thrive on.
So I looked after the kelp forest, I think, for about 4 or 5 years. I was looking after the kelp forest and water quality, really, were the two areas that I was concentrating on. And the kelp forest, it's the cold exhibit at the aquarium. So the diving in there, spending several hours in there, either tying down kelp or cleaning up was always quite hard work. And collecting the kelp, you know, our rocks are all at different heights, and it's quite important that you collect kelp that essentially doesn't stick out of the water at the top, because the plants in there are really Eclonia maxima, the sea bamboo, which is the species which most people are familiar with, because you see it sticking out at low tide. And the reason you see it sticking out is it has a float at the top of the stipe, the stem. And so if you collect plants that are too tall, even by 20 centimeters, then they stick out permanently in that exhibit, and then they get burnt by the sun, and the plants don't last very long. So collecting it was always challenging, in that you kind of needed a range of sizes that you collected that was suitable for the different rocks in there. And then when you brought it all back, this huge lump of kelp that everyone helped walk up the stairs or lift up in the hoist, and then got dumped into the kelp forest, then you spent a couple of hours choosing the plants and tying them down to the rocks. Kelp plants have a holdfast. It's not a root system. It's just a system that allows them to grip onto the rock well. So you prise them off gently in the wild, and then if you tie them down nicely in the kelp forest, then that holdfast grows again, and then they fasten themselves down onto the rock. But yeah, hours in the cold water exhibit, it seems like a lifetime ago, but that's where I started when I was at the aquarium in 1997.
Hi, I'm Simon, and I'm in the collections department. We are in charge of collecting all the animals that you see in the aquarium.
Hi, I'm Matthew. I'm a collections officer at the Two Oceans Aquarium, and I work under Simon in the collections department. So prepping for the kelp collection, we got to make sure our boat is fueled. We normally will launch quite early in the morning to ensure that we get out and back into the aquarium nice and early, so that the divers at the aquarium have time to tie down the kelp. When we go out for the kelp collection and making sure we're prepared, we make sure that we have all our safety gear, our oxygen, our first aid kits. For PPE, we will have everyone on board who is not diving specifically have their rainproof jackets and overalls, and any waterproof clothing is ideal, especially during winter. Keep them warm, as the boat does get a bit wet.
So the role of the skipper when we're going out to sea is responsible for the safety of everybody on the boat. The skipper is in charge of actually driving the vessel, taking the team to the location where we need to go and dive. He's also in charge of notifying anybody that we are diving in the areas we are working in. So when we're collecting kelp, the skipper is responsible for the divers in the water. He makes sure that they are all safe, knows where they are at all times. The skipper will also send out a notification to the harbour master in Robben Island if we're going to dive at Robben Island.
So once the skipper is happy with the area that we're going to collect the kelp, the divers will jump in the water. We will descend down normally 4 to 5 meters, depending on the kelp length required. Then once there, we follow the stipe of the kelp down to the holdfast, which is basically similar to a root system of a normal plant, but doesn't have the same function. So we'll dive down there, and delicately with a knife, we'll cut the holdfast around and remove as nice of a holdfast as we can, keeping it in contact so that the divers back at the aquarium have a nice base that they can tie down the kelp to the floor again.
So the kelp forest, that we have a kelp forest exhibit is really essential to us. I mean, as the Two Oceans Aquarium, trying to portray the difference between the cold, nutrient-rich West Coast and the nutrient-poor, highly diverse East Coast, a kelp forest was an absolute requirement. But they're high maintenance, they take a lot of time and effort, lots of staff. And because of that, there's actually very few of them in the world. When I joined here, there really were only 2. Monterey Bay Aquarium, that has kelp literally on their doorstep. They dive from the aquarium out, collect kelp, and they have a crane on the roof and they lift it up and into their exhibit. But they've got 10 or 12 plants that are specifically in certain places, which never changes. So ours really, for me, was a proper kelp forest. It's like a jungle when you're in there, a bamboo jungle. So yeah, they're very few and far between, and most certainly one of our most prized exhibits at the aquarium.
So then getting the kelp, once we've cut the kelp, to get it onto the boat, we do need some hands. So we often take people from in-house, and they will help us get the kelp on board the boat and just help with the process of manpower and getting the kelp back safely.
Okay, once the kelp's been collected, we'll make sure that all the divers are safely back on the boat. All the equipment's been removed from the water. We'll check the kelp is nicely covered and the kelp is moist. What we'll then do is we'll return to the aquarium as quickly as possible and as safely as possible. We don't want the kelp to get damaged on the boat by bouncing around too much. And throughout the journey, we'll keep wetting the kelp so it stays nice and moist and it's in as best condition as we can get it back to the aquarium.
Summon the troops.
Territorio, territorio! Met de mensen naar back door.
So once we've made our way back to the slipway with the kelp on board, we will remove the boat and make our way back to the aquarium. So at the aquarium, we'll get a whole lot of helping hands. We'll call on the radio and all of the aquarists that are available will come downstairs and we will offload the kelp to the aquarists on the side, and they will walk the kelp nice and carefully, making sure it doesn't touch the ground. They will place it into our hoist box, and then once the box is full of the kelp, we'll lift that hoist up to the roof, and then from the roof, we'll offload it into the exhibit straight away.
Hi, my name is Daniel. I'm the service/maintenance diver here at the Two Oceans Aquarium. My role is to basically dive all day. I dive in all the 3 big tanks, whether it's cleaning, whether feeding the fish or doing maintenance work on the tanks. In talking about our kelp collections and tying down, once we get the kelp off the boat and up the hoist, our aquarists throw the kelp into the top of the kelp, where we will have myself and maybe 3 other divers. We will then, once all the kelp is loaded into the tank, we will then pull the kelp from the holdfast down. We have a bunch of bungee cord, which is what we use to tie the kelp down onto the rock. And on the rock there are like loops made in them, little tie points. And what we do is you want to get the holdfast as square onto the rock as possible, and then use the bungee cord to tie kind of through the middle of the holdfast. That way the kelp will start to reattach itself. So the holdfast is basically the root system of the kelp, what keeps the kelp grounded. And once we tie that firmly on the rock, over time it starts to reattach. That way we can take the bungee cord off and the kelp will, then it's still live, it's still living, and it's still growing within our tanks. people might think that, okay, putting in the new kelp causes a disturbance in the tank. I assure you it doesn't. The fish love it when the new kelp comes in, because once you tie the new kelp along on the holdfast, you'll find a lot of crustaceans maybe, or some urchins. These are all things that these fish in the kelp forest eat. So when we're putting the new kelp down, you always see after we tie it down, you'll get a rush of fish coming to that new kelp. They pick off on the worms, and it's just more nutrients for them as well.
Hi, my name is Yolanda. I am the aquarist that looks after our Kelp Forest Exhibit at the Two Oceans Aquarium. So for kelp in the wild to flourish, they need good sunlight, they need cold water, and they need water movement. So what we try and do in our exhibit is we try to mimic the natural environment that they are found in. So the first thing we do is we get fresh water in. So our water, this is an open system, which means that there's constantly water flowing into the exhibit, and there's overflows that take water out. So it's a constant flow of water so that our kelp can have fresh water flowing over the ponds. We also have a plunger and spray bars at the top of the exhibit that moves the water to mimic the ocean moving around. So that's how we just make sure that the kelp is happy in our exhibit. The other thing that we have is we have a heat exchange system on this exhibit that has a chiller pump that makes sure as the water comes in, it runs through the chiller pump that makes sure that we keep our water cold to mimic the ocean outside. The ideal temperature that we want our exhibit to be on is about 14 to 15, 16 degrees Celsius. So we always try to keep the water as cold as possible. To keep the exhibit looking nice, I do maintenance in this exhibit when we dive in here. So usually we would dive in this exhibit to siphon and clean the sand, or to feed the fish and the sharks. And when we do that, we go in and we, just like a gardener, go and clean up all the old funds and any old plants that have died, that have fallen over. And then we just take them out, we take them to the top, and they get taken to the composting.
I'm Vincent Calder. I was started here at the Two Oceans back in 1994 in October as an aquarist. This kelp tank was quite something to behold when they started it. It was built to be about 780 cubes of water, 1,000 cubes of water, and all the rock work that was put in here it's not the rock work you see today. This rock work is like a swimming pool where they gunite the concrete onto a frame and then shape it. And we had a guy called Duncan Forbes, him and our curator and our director went out to Cape Point Nature Reserve, and they went and showed us lovely pieces of rock. And then Duncan used a silicon mold, and he made a mold over all this, the rock, and then when they pulled it off, they got the exact replica of the rockwork. And then those sheets, they could cut up into all sorts of shapes to make it look naturally like towering rocks or overhangs and whatever. And poor old Duncan worked here like a slave here, and then the curator, Pat Garrett, used to come along and he'd say, Duncan would say, "How does this look, Pat?" And then Pat would go, yeah. And then poor old Duncan used to think, oh God, got to take this whole lot off again. Anyway, so eventually the rocks were all put in, and they stood there on our sand rock, and then the tank was filled, the splay was filled up, and everything looked lovely, And then we had our wave generator, which you can see over there. it's a plunge of pushing out water and then sucking up and pushing up water. And they put that on and all the rocks started to float around and get washed around, and they thought, oh, that's a problem there. So I think it had to be emptied again, and then they put down a framework of railway lines, a whole network of it, and then fiberglass those rocks onto there. So that's how that came out. So now they were very firm. And then I remember one morning the director said to me, Vince, why don't you just go in, because the water was about up to my knees, I think. Why don't you just go in, take a net and scoop up all the cigarette butts and things and that's floating around, because when the workers were working, they'd smoke and throw it down. And so I'd go walking around, scooping with my net. Oh, lovely. And there's a window on the far side. I'd forgotten there was a big hole that was being dug in the gravel so that we could put a pump suction right in there to pump the water out when you wanted to do so. And I came walking around through these beautiful big rocks, and I ended up boom, completely under in-back flow. And I looked towards the window, and there were two people standing there. They were absolutely in hysterics. And all I could do was just laugh. And those people were just people that used to walk into the building while we were constructing it and just, sneak in and come and look through the window.
We've got such a stunning kelp forest exhibit, and for many of our visitors here in South Africa, it's the first time that they'll ever be getting a glimpse at this magical kelp forest and all the teeming life that lives and thrives within this ecosystem. It really also brings in a sense of protection, so we're not just wanting to protect the seaweed, but it's protecting this cultural heritage that we so greatly foster in Cape Town and in South Africa, regarding communities that have stretched back many hundreds of years around the time of die strandloper. So back when they used to sort of walk, these coastal communities used to walk the beach, picking up shells. So it really ties in with our heritage in terms of foraging and always utilizing the marine space for subsistence. So our kelp forest is an exhibit and a tribute to culture. It's essentially giving recognition to biodiversity and the importance of these kelp forests. And so when people see the kelp forest or visit our kelp forest, it should leave that message of protecting the seaweed, but then also protecting our cultural heritage that we are so deeply tied to and connected to. So we are very lucky at the Two Oceans Aquarium to exhibit live kelp and to have such a large biodiversity within the exhibit itself to showcase people, and hopefully through showcasing this biodiversity we are able to foster that sense of care and relation to their culture and heritage. Another way in which kelp is so important is medicinal purposes. So there are lots of coastal communities that forage kelp for many different reasons, one of being its medicinal properties. So lots of research has been done on red algae regarding its cancer properties, so assisting in cancer treatments and various other different ways and purposes. But it also, in terms of the products we use every day, I mean, brown algae is used in the wine industry. It's used in ice cream, for example, as a binding agent. So on our everyday lives now, even if we don't see that impact, we are interacting with algae on a daily basis and we just don't know about it.